Well, first of all, welcome, and very, very happy to be here. So I would like to start by basically thanking the organizers and Anna-Marie in particular for having found me. But it's a great pleasure to be in front of you. I guess the topic of today is around innovation, and as Claudio said, I am Chief Development Officer for an organization called MPI, and really what we are is we're the largest community of meeting and events professionals in the world. And my role within that specific organization is basically to look at product development. It includes market development, so I cover everything that is not North America. And I cover all of our research agenda, our knowledge agenda, and I spend a big part of my job basically looking at what's out there, talking to our members, coming to events like this, to basically learn about what is keeping the industry up at night. So again, just a few numbers. I'm not going to go through this, but we're a fairly large organization in the field of meeting and events altogether. I'll first start because I believe that in order to understand where the industry is potentially going, we first need to understand where we are and what happened over the last few years. So, I think that's probably the best short quote that I have found about where the world economy is at the moment. We still don't know exactly where it's going to go. Obviously Europe is having a lot of issues with sovereign debt. The US kind of rebounded, but nobody really knows what the 360% level of debt, that's being the federal government, the state government, and the private debt factor ratio to GDP is going to do. China has seen its real estate market go down 25% over the last quarter. So even these economies, we just don't know exactly where it's going to go. I think something that we can all agree upon is that actually we've been through a pretty big crisis overall. And as President Obama said at one point in time, the other one? Further? Yep. Go ahead. As I said, never raised a good crisis overall, but I think more importantly is recognizing that the markets are changing. And the markets are changing, obviously, from a geographical standpoint. I mean, you see it over there, and I was in China with our board of directors 6 weeks ago, listening to the development of cities, and it's absolutely amazing, the urbanization that is taking place there. But, by the same token, you have regions like the Gulf, and Dubai obviously being the most well-known, but Abu Dhabi as well, building infrastructure. Oman is building an international convention centers and exhibition centers. Doha, who obviously will be hosting FIFA World Cup, will build by the FIFA World Cup 120,000 hotel rooms. It's the equivalent of Manhattan. That's going to come in terms of inventory. So, you see basically a huge amount of development of infrastructure, which creates opportunity in terms of outbound markets, because as our industry starts developing and maturing in these countries, actually our industry is developing and maturing as well. And so the use of meeting, events, trade show, fairs as business tools is actually becoming increasingly accepted. So obviously it is new competition, but on the other hand, it creates awareness and maturity for our industry overall. Mobility is going to continue to increase. Actually, travel and business travel has been incredibly resilient through this recession, with a big dip in 2009, but a very steep rebound in 2010, 11, and actually carrying on even to 12. I think what's important to outline as well, and I will get back to that when I'll talk about the digital world, is the fact that for the first time ever in the history of mankind, we will have 4 generations actively involved in the workforce. So you will go all the way from baby boomers who will retire, there is no doubt, at a later age. As they start retiring, the age of retiring will actually increase, so they will stay active in the workforce. And at the same time, millennials or digital natives entering the workforce, and they have very, very, very different expectations in terms of how they interact with each other. And I'm personally convinced that it's going to significantly transform how we build live events overall, And under live events, I really put all of the umbrellas of meeting, congresses, fairs, trade shows, incentive travel, and so on and so forth. I think you will also see, and we're seeing it already, more women in the workforce than ever before. I think China will be a big driver of that. You have a number of Chinese women in pretty high-end position, and I think you will continue to see basically more women entering that. And as we all know, they have a very, very different way of interacting, interfacing, leading, and so on and so forth. So what I'll talk is, some of these changes. Go ahead. As I mentioned, never waste, a good crisis. And, some of the things we've seen through that crisis, we saw them before, but really the last 4 years have been a tremendous accelerator in terms of seeing them coming to fruition. Obviously, the digital world, and we have seen the largest IPO ever with Facebook, obviously went down a lot later. But I think overall, Google also playing a very active role at gathering and disseminating content. And I don't think we should underestimate that as an industry. I've heard over the last day and a half a lot of conversation around content and around shows having to be more than simply marketplace, but becoming catalyst for an industry or catalyst for a brand. Well, what Google is doing in wanting to become the biggest library of the world is basically making content that used to be only accessible in closed circles, making it accessible to absolutely everybody. Which then bears the question is, why would you come here to listen to me if the only thing I'm doing is giving you a one-way conversation? You can do that in a number of other ways, and you can do that with Skype, you can do that to YouTube, you can do that. There could be a webcam back there in this room broadcasting this to the entire community that we're involved with, and people wouldn't have to show up. The reason why you're showing up is for that conversation, and I'll get back to that afterwards. Huge impact as well for organizations overall is obviously social media. Again, if you're coming here to network, you can network in a far less qualitative way, but you can still network using all of these. We're a community of 22,000 people. We have right now about 14,000 of them actively involved in forums on LinkedIn. So why would they pay their membership dues to belong to a community like ours if they can just go out there and do that by themselves? And oh, by the way, they can do that wherever they are, because the Web 3.0 is going to be all about that. Web 1.0 was all about just searching website and getting information from it. Web 2.0 was all about the interaction and the interface. Web 3.0 is all about mobility. 20% of the purchases online today are done through mobile devices, and that's going to continue to increase. So having solutions, and I'll get back to it, in terms of tackling that mobility and the geolocation factor is going to be absolutely essential. Something else that I've heard, and actually back to the previous presentation, and I'm a big Angry Bird fan, but one of the things that I've heard is tools in terms of matchmaking, and these tools are internet-based and they're web-based. And I'll show you the next graph. There was a great article in the November issue of Wired magazine last year, and literally the title of the article was "The Web is Dead," making a very strong point that actually web consumption is decreasing. We have confused, or many people have confused, the internet, which is the platforms that allow the exchange of data, and the web, which is really the search engine and the browsing capabilities. We don't browse as much as we used to. We go directly on peer-to-peer and messagings and forums and all of that. We go to YouTube, and we go to applications. And that is basically now how people consume increasingly the content and basically use applications. We've seen that at some of our own live events that we organize. We do our largest event is about 3,500 people. 3,000 people downloaded our application. And that is the way they interface with each other. It's the way they made appointments, it's the way they looked at their calendar, it's the way they access videos, it's the way they purchase books from our speakers. It's basically, that was their digital interface with the event, with purely application. Nothing to do with going to the web. Which bears the next question to all of you: how much money do you invest in your apps? How much money do you invest in your web presence? How much money do you invest in your video presence? For the first time a couple of years ago, video consumption broke the 50% mark on the internet consumption. So the vast majority of the content consumed today on the internet is actually video. It's up to 60% in Asia because they're a very visual culture and they just like visual communication overall. But so again, are you present on those? Because this is where your brand really needs to be, because this is where consumers are going overall. Obviously, we've seen some pretty drastic budget constraints overall. We all know that. A lot of people thought that corporate social responsibility and sustainability in general would actually go down as a priority. There are some evidence after Rio +20 last week that it is from a political standpoint. From a business standpoint, it isn't. Actually, 1 week prior to Rio, Google announced that they were completing a $1 billion investment in wind energy. Lego has committed $500 million in wind energy as well to power their plant. And basically what drove some of these decisions is the rise in other energy costs. Because what CEOs, and there is a great McKinsey report on that, what CEOs have realized is if they can produce the same output using less input, it is not about the planet. It's about good business sense. And so they're now driving rationalization of the use of resources from a business agenda standpoint. And yes, absolutely, it does contribute to be good corporate citizens as well. But so that agenda, and we see it, and I'll go back to it within our industry, what it means, but we see sustainability still being at the forefront of the preoccupation, and again, specifically in Asia. Obviously, travel's constrained, some of them dictated by sustainability measures, some of them obviously dictated by things like the Lafayette Code a few years ago, and some of the others. But again, travel overall being watched more than anything else, and we heard Ari Breinen yesterday talked about the fact that UFI considered that as a potential looming threat to our industry overall, the fact that people will travel less. I don't think they will travel less. I think they will travel differently, and they will more and more travel for the right reason. A lot of things we're hearing within our circles are right sizing. Who do we need to send to that particular live event? Who can we simply, and I'll go back to it on hybrid event, who can we basically simply have plugged in and engage remotely? Do we need to meet physically, and so what for? Or basically can we use other ways of interacting and interfacing and conducting business? So I think it's about adapting to some of those. I don't think I've said anything new. Quite frankly, you probably knew a lot of these. Maybe just putting some context around the need for innovation within our industry if we want to survive. As I mentioned, in the field of sustainability, these are coming. You now have an ISO for sustainable event. That ISO has been completed, launched about 3 months ago. Last week, the Danish government announced that the European presidency of the European Union, made by Denmark, is actually ISO sustained. So it is actually ISO certified, and all of their meetings will apply all of these standards. The Olympics will apply these standards. We're starting to see it in requests for proposals from companies, basically saying, what are you doing in terms of sustainable events overall? A global reporting initiative as well, which is driven by the United Nations. And basically what they have done is by vertical sectors, they have defined how you should report your footprint. Your carbon footprint, your waste footprint, and all of those. And they have done that for the pharma industry, for the automotive industry, and about 1.5 years ago, they've done that, or they started doing that for the event sector. So looking at initially mega events, and we worked with them, with FIFA, with the Olympics Committee, with some of these organizations, and basically looking at if you have a citywide event of a large magnitude, how do you start standardizing the report? Needless to say, it will provide input into our industry. A lot of fairs, a lot of shows are citywide, a lot of large conventions are citywide, and so you will start seeing some standards coming out in terms of how to do these. I think the biggest paradigm shift that we're going to see in our industry is some of our industry is still stuck in logistics. Some of our industry still believes that their core business is logistics and project management. Some part has moved away from that slightly and has basically said, no, we're part of communication. And I've heard that yesterday on saying, we shouldn't forget that we're part of communication. I would say, and I would argue, that we need to push that even one step further. Because as I mentioned, communicating, we're overwhelmed by communication. We're overwhelmed by messaging, by things coming at us, by marketing campaign, by all of these. The key issue now, the number one issues, again, for CEOs, is actually how do we engage customers? How do we have them come to us versus us interrupting them? And I think our industry provides that physical platform to create that engagement. No other media does that. No other media creates experience, feelings, loyalty the way we do. Now the question is, how do we embrace that and basically make that very unique? Let me show you some slides on how important it is to CEOs. Basically, if you ask at the company level, 2/3 of them say that it was very important, and only 3% said it wasn't important at all. If you ask, is it part of your boardroom conversation? Again, 86% of them, of CEOs, and these are CEOs of Fortune 1000 companies on a global basis, 86% of them, it is critical. Good news for our industry. When we then ask them, out of all of the media that you have available, all of the channels that you have out there to get in contact with your customer base, with your distributors, with the people out there, what are the most effective and what create the highest level of engagement? Just click through. Nope, one before. That's where we are. So there is no doubt in the eyes of CEOs and senior executives that we are actually the medium that create the highest level of engagement ever. How do we capitalize that? How do we build a case? How do we give them case studies to demonstrate that even further? So what is happening, and I'll cover that briefly now, is, in terms of the power of live experience, and I think I've made the point about how powerful it is, I also talked about social media. And basically, in my view, the biggest opportunities that we have from an engagement standpoint is how do we embrace the other media? How do we embrace the digital world? And by doing all of that, how do we basically engage and sustain business relationship year-round? And we heard that from the previous panel, but it's really the nut that we have to crack. My biggest fear as an industry, and I've been in this industry for about 20 years now, if we don't do it this way, I can guarantee you that it's going to go this way. And I can guarantee you that at one point in time, technology companies, digital companies, and all of that will find a way to create year-round engagement, including live events as well. And so for us, it's how do we embrace, how do we get ahead of that curve? So I think the biggest attendance for growth opportunity and revenue opportunity overall is obviously outside of our room in itself. Yeah. So I don't think we'll have meetings like this an awful lot more in the future. There might be some meetings like this. This is Cisco, their sales meeting. A couple of years ago, after taking severe hit, they basically decided to go fully digital. So GSX is their sales meeting, gathered 7,000 salespeople of Cisco on a worldwide basis. They went fully online. Worked with a lot of gaming companies, worked with a lot of IT companies, and built a digital environment and a virtual environment to do that. Highest level of participation ever. When they did the metrics after the event, lowest level of engagement ever. People showed up, they didn't engage. What is happening now is we see events like these, which is Sapphire Now. And this is one of the hybrid events that we have seen, one of the most successful one, and Cisco Live is another example. That's what their meeting room looks like now. Their meeting rooms is completely about pods, conversation, open space, basically creating the conversation overall, because they have realized that if it's simply to have a keynote speaker up on stage, delivering a message to an audience in a dark room, there's better ways to do that. And basically what they have done, if they've done everything possible, so their physical meetings creates content versus delivers content from someone. So they've changed the way that they've considered that and saying we need to foster better communication, we need to capture the intellectual capital that we have there, because again, there's no other media that can do that. And then we need to create, based on that, a community globally overall. So they had a number of, these was their two main events that they linked with 28 virtual meeting rooms. And then they linked a number of satellite events on a global basis. And during 1 week was basically Sapphire Now Week. What they have done on top of that, they've hired an entire team of social media. And they have engaged their entire community. So anyone who touches SAP, it can be media, can be programmers, can be analysts, can be employees, can be basically had an opportunity to go and to participate. Some of the results, here it is, 16,000 people physically, but they gathered a total community of 50,000 people. Actually, during that week, the third most tweeted word in the world was Sapphire Now. And what they were doing is every day they were basically broadcasting, they built an entire TV studio, they were broadcasting their meeting out and basically saying this is what we're talking about, this is the information, this is the business we're conducting, be part of it. And they were capturing the conversation on social media, and at the end of every day they were basically giving an update. And they were telling the entire community, this is what we've done. These are some of the things that obviously you're concerned about. This is how we're answering those. This is the product we've launched today. Do you have any question about it? We're happy to answer those. So they've basically mobilized their community overall, and that conversation continues. You basically have sapphirenow.com, and that conversation continues, and they've created an entire community around it. Another company that does that extremely well is Cisco Live. Same thing. Cisco Live is now a community of 60,000 people engaged actively with Cisco year-round. The only thing they do, they provide them 4 touch points. Basically 4 physical environments where the community can just get together. But they have fundamentally transformed how they approached it. The good news about this, didn't cost them anything more. What they used to do, they used to have an entire marketing team that was basically working on their big event. And that marketing team would launch a campaign 9 months out, would go out with a theme, would ask people to register, pay $2,000 to register, would then feature the speakers 6 months out. I mean, you're familiar with this, just a traditional marketing campaign overall. And then the event would happen, and then they would go dark for 3-4 months. And then they would start all over again. And what they found out is by shifting these marketing campaigns to social media and community building, they were basically able to keep them engaged year-round. No need for marketing campaign anymore. Basically, they are there. You've built it, they're active, they're engaged, they want to be there. So again, same opportunities to basically engage and sustain participation overall. So, some shift that we're seeing out there and some new skills. How do you tell your story? The story of your brand and your community building versus simply the story of your live event, and how do you start engaging people more sustainably? How do you use new skills in terms of TV, content, broadcasting, videos, I mentioned that already, in terms of bringing your event way outside of your meeting space or exhibition space for that matter? How do you make connectivity far easier at your event in itself? And that's obviously is a challenge for a lot of venues that do not have T3, T4 fiber optics lines, do not have the bandwidth to sustain some of those, or are charging a fortune for it. So how do you make that easier? I think more fundamentally is how do you create platforms where people can basically collaborate and co-create? Because I'm convinced that this is what people will go to events, live events, in the future. It is going to be far more to do that, because a lot of the rest of it, the information gathering, the product gathering, all of these things, there's other ways to do it that are far cheaper and far less time consuming. So just some thoughts in terms of what we believe the road ahead is. As I mentioned, meetings will actually not be the end of the content and the distribution of the content, but will truly be the creation of it. They will be hybrid. They will obviously be far more multicultural with all of the implication that it has. You know, a lot of people talk about outbound from emerging markets like India and China. You know, there's going to be about 120 million Indians traveling to Europe over the next 5 years. Yet you go to most hotels in most European cities, and I would argue in most world cities outside of India, and if you find 2 vegetarian things on your room service menu, you're very lucky. So what does that mean in terms of changing our habits and doing business? Sustainability will be important, and a lot of new skills will be needed within our industry overall. So a few thoughts again on the topic of innovation. You know, where are you located? Not only physically, but also on the information highways. Do you have a data center level 4 next to you? Do you have fiber optics? Do you give the opportunity to your physical venue to be connected to the rest of the world? Again, do you have a mobile strategy overall? Do you create video content at your event yourself as a company and as a brand? Do you broadcast that? If you don't, you're missing half of the internet traffic. Are you using applications? Can your organization engage? Do you have people who actively engage with your customers, who basically actively go on social media and are part of the conversation, are not intruding their conversation, but are part of their conversation overall? Are you aligned and learning some lessons? Again, do you know what the sustainability practices and standards are being? What is your model as a venue? And I think there's a lot to be said there. Do you have the right, there's no way you can do that by yourself. So, do you have the right supply chain that can basically help you deliver all of that? And then, do you have the right skill sets within your organization overall? So again, some thought starter for, hopefully the conversation that we're going to have right after this. And just one final thought, we just need absolutely to think differently because our industry is evolving rapidly. The needs of our audiences, be it our clients or be it our customers, and be it, quite frankly, our suppliers as well, are changing pretty drastically as well. So how do we tackle it? With that, obrigado, gracias.